is probably what the internet was built for, sharing information, sharing knowledge.
Happy to kind of just introduce myself quickly. So I'm one of the co-founders of Vidos. I look after everything from kind of our partnership side to all of our kind of product research, speaking with a lot of folks in the financial institutions, education, as you mentioned, travel, and a lot of the standards bodies and consortiums that are kind of working in this space at the moment.
What about you, Tom?
Hi, I'm Tom. I focus primarily on the marketing side of Vidos. I touch a little bit on the community aspect and events and things like that. But yeah, primarily supporting from my marketing background.
Awesome. Tell us a little bit more, y'all, about what Vidos is.
I guess just from the top, Vidos really at the core of it is just a set of reliable managed services that make it really easy for companies to take advantage of the different types of digital identifiers and verifiable credentials that we're seeing in the ecosystem. And kind of specifically what we mean by that is helping companies, what we call relying parties, to integrate the acceptance and verification of these identities and credentials into their existing applications and their business processes. Because I think we, from our side, sort of saw the best way that we could contribute to accelerating the adoption of self-sovereign identity systems was by trying to take the guesswork out of the equation for the relying party side and make the technologies that this incredible ecosystem has built around kind of issuing credentials and identity providers, and just make them as easy to use and as valuable as possible.
Yeah, at the core of what Vidos is trying to do is alleviate some of the pains of adopting these technologies, because depending on the situation that a company is in, it can be a massive upheaval and a massive shift to start dealing with new identities, new technologies, etc. So Vidos is there to take that burden on and provide something that they understand and that they can work with from the get-go, basically. Yeah.
So you all have like a couple of like resources and content that you all do, kind of educating people about how a digital identity works. And I really like the one you all have on like digital identity in education. So particularly, I'm curious about like, how do you see like SSI or digital identity impacting or benefiting education?
The benefit I see as kind of like a whole in SSI is in education is kind of that it makes this data portability and the ease of the trusted global verification possible. And I think that is just like one of the kind of critical benefits to understand about SSI as a whole is just this ability to kind of connect and unsilo our real world systems, which are just now predominantly digitized, but remembering that we need to do this in a secure and user-centric way. Our teachers have some of the hardest and most important jobs in the world. Like, the point isn't to give teachers another technology, but to try and sort of reduce the time that they spend in convoluted IT systems so that they can actually spend more time face-to-face with students. And I don't see it so much as the technology changing the landscape of education itself, but I think what's so important to see is the landscape of education has shifted and our technologies are kind of having to evolve to meet these shifts. So what we see today is actually this concept kind of thought of as like lifelong learning, and it's a much more transitory global economy. So there's lots of different types of routes through the education system now. A lot of people no longer just like go to school for a set amount of consecutive years, then go on to have one or two jobs in that same country. Instead, we're seeing people sort of go to school, get a job, go back to school, get a new job in a totally different country, learn specific skills and get qualifications in that job that then they can use in another job. And it kind of just keeps going. And it's a much more interwoven system between kind of education and employment, and the number of credentials, so to speak, that are related to our learning and our development that we're picking up on this journey has just like significantly increased. So everyone that's in this system now needs kind of better connective tools to handle these changes. And we're seeing that students and employees need a way to port their achievements from one place to another, and employers also need a way to easily verify what could be a number of different transcripts and claims from different schools and workplaces across like different countries and continents.
Tom, let us know, since you're the creator of the content.
I think you touched really on the core of the problem, is that when the internet was born, of all of the things that could be digitized and spread out across the world. I think education, and I mean it in the sense of learning, not even necessarily the formal sense of education, is probably what the internet was built for: sharing information, sharing knowledge. And it's done a really good job of that. Platforms like YouTube, Twitch, etc., have done a fantastic job of connecting people who know a lot of information to the people who want to learn about it. And it's easier than ever to go on YouTube and search whatever it is that you want to learn about. However, the transfer of knowledge has not been followed up with the transfer of the credentials and the validity of that knowledge. So it's very hard for someone to go onto YouTube or Twitch or Udemy or whatever platform it is digitally and understand that the person that they're learning from is verified, a good educator, knows what they're talking about, 20 years in the business or whatever it is. One of the things that digital identities and decentralized identities has brought to the table is that legitimacy to the standard that you get from like a professor or from a university or another institute. You can categorically say that this person, has the credentials to talk about whatever it is that they're teaching about. That's a fantastic opportunity. I think that's really interesting. And then on the other side of the same coin, you have students who maybe they went to Oxford or Harvard or wherever, and they got a degree in whatever field they've got it in: computer science, engineering, English, whatever. They get a nice big shiny piece of paper that says that they followed the curriculum and they know, enough about that experience. You can learn just as much online these days, or from smaller institutes or from smaller educators, but you don't necessarily get the big shiny piece of paper, which isn't a problem. That's fine. I'm not saying that there isn't any validity in that, in those institutions. But what the problem arises is in the exchange and communication between those things. So as an example, me and Misha are based in the UK. If I went to get a degree in Oxford and I walked away with it, and then I went to, apply for either a further education or another job in another country, let's say India, how do they weigh up how much I learned from Oxford and the courses I've done and the modules I've done and the knowledge I have from the year that it was relevant against their curriculum, to say that these sort of two educational units are equivalent or whatever? Because currently the knowledge doesn't get wrapped digitally. The institution does. Like, you can go, oh, Oxford, yeah, I've heard of Oxford, or yeah, I've heard of Harvard. But if it's a little school that you haven't heard of, how can you still say that this bit of knowledge is equivalent or transferable? So that's one of the things that digital identities will bring to the education world, which I think is really cool. And another thing is the expiry of knowledge. A lot of industries, particularly computer science, moves at such a pace. Someone with a computer science degree from the 70s is not the same as a computer science degree from 2010 or whatever. Not to say that they aren't both valuable, but we need to know if someone has topped up their stuff. If someone got computer science degrees in the 70s and then they've been learning every day and working every year to achieve more and keep up to date, that should be reflected in their digital identity. Like, okay, yeah, you did get a degree in the 70s, but you've been working hard and you've kept up to date every year since. That should be reflected in your application to whatever it is you're trying to do with that knowledge. And these are the sort of problems that digital identity solutions aim to tackle in the education realm. I mean,
Yeah,
it's such a big thing. It works in every industry, but I think those are the most exciting things in education. Yeah.
For anyone who's interested in kind of the sort of learning employment system as a whole, I would definitely check out the Digital Credential Consortium, the DDC. They have a LER ecosystem map, which is super helpful to understand all those moving pieces.
Yeah, you came up with so many examples that I've never thought of. Let me see if I can organize my thoughts because you brought up so many good examples. One of having the certified person, right? Because I've had many moments where I've bought a Udemy course when I was younger,
Yeah, yeah.
or like just learning to code, and then I'm like, oh, this is crap. Like they showed me in the preview, they made it seem like it was going to be
And you
good.
got like, oh,
Yeah.
it's 5 stars with 49 reviews. You're like, yeah, cool. But then you don't
It's not
know the legitimacy of that. And also it might be a really good course and a really good educator, but they're teaching you stuff that's 5 years out of date.
Yes,
So you're
that's
like,
so
I didn't
true.
know that. But maybe that's a good thing if you're starting out or whatever. But it's
Still,
hard to know. Yeah.
yeah, it's
It's no
hard to
equivalency
figure.
to learn these things. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that example. And then the other example I loved was like the credentials in different countries because I
Mm.
have like I'm from a different country and I have many friends who like went from a different country to America and then they're like, oh, they have to get kept back because they can't prove of what they've learned. And I'm like, some of those countries they're learning a little bit more than the US.
Well,
So
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. It's so hard to do. And I'm not saying that digital identities are going to solve all of these problems, but they will be a stepping stone to opening the conversations about how we elaborate on those things. Because it gives a sort of level playing field to everything. You carry all of your credentials with you, and as you were talking about, like some schools don't exist anymore, so you can't even email the dean and be like, were they a good student? That this person doesn't exist anymore. So does that credential just disappear? No, of course not. It needs to be kept somewhere. And I think the great thing about the idea of self-sovereign identities matched with verified credentials is that it's on the individual to manage that and to keep that alive, but backed by the authority of a verified system. Yeah.
Love that. And y'all can't see the comments in our Discord. We also stream this here, but we have a lot of people saying like, this makes so much sense. This happens to so many of my family members. Like, this would help with gatekeeping and all that. Before we get into the demo, I want to like give Misha a chance to say her thoughts, and then we'll jump into the demo.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Tom covered a huge amount of that. I think the education system is going to be one of the most exciting places for SSI because I think it's more so one of those places where the actual individuals in the system have really felt the effects of not having these kind of technologies in place and the ability to kind of take achievements with them where they go. So yeah, I think I would also say if folks are kind of interested in the education space, definitely kind of look at One EdTech, who manage kind of all the sort of badging standards and things like that, but they do a lot of the work there. And then other ones I'd also definitely recommend looking at are like the Learning Economy, who do some amazing things around education credentials, and Velocity Network as well also do. So there are some fantastic people in this space.
The open badges system by One EdTech is eye-opening. It's fantastic. Definitely check that out if you're interested.
Yeah, things for me to know, and I'll try to add those in the show notes as well. All right, let's jump into the demo, y'all. Let's see what's there.
I'll hand back over to you, Misha. Take it away.
The publicly released Vidos Universal Resolver as our first product. And this is used for DID resolution. When explaining DID resolution, I always find it kind of helpful to start at some of the foundations to actually set the context. I know we've got kind of people from different backgrounds in the audience, starting with understanding a DID being just a globally unique identifier, kind of string of characters that can represent anything from you, a person, to an organization or a thing or entity across the web. And the power of DIDs is that they enable these verifiable, decentralized digital identities to exist. And I think that word verifiable is critical. The second important thing to know about DIDs is that they have an associated DID document. These DID documents contain the cryptographic material, amongst other things, that are needed for the verification processes. So That's where the DID resolver actually comes in. The DID resolver is used by the verifier or the client to get the DID document and any associated metadata so that the client can then carry out any actions related to that DID, using the cryptographic material to basically go and get the keys that you need to run the checks against the verifiable credentials that have been presented with the DID, or things like getting the service endpoints to interact with secure protocols. At a very simple level, I think the main thing to understand is just you can't verifiably do anything with the DID without first getting the DID document. I actually tend to liken it to a sort of analogy of a library catalog, where you can imagine kind of a vast library with millions of books, and like all libraries, each book has a unique book code so that you can go and find the book in that library. When you go into this gigantic library to find a specific book, you search the book's unique code in the designated library catalog system, and it's the catalog system that tells you where to go and find that book so that you can go and retrieve it and access the contents. The catalog system is the resolver. You give it the DID, it lets you retrieve the associated DID document. The problem, and where kind of this like nice day out at the library situation gets a little bit more complicated, is there are in fact hundreds of libraries. All DIDs have a DID method. And what the DID method does is it tells the resolver which verifiable data registry to go and get the DID document from. A local host blockchain, web server, or obviously in TBD's case, the BitTorrent protocol. And there's hundreds of DID methods. In the real world, that means individually setting up and managing infrastructure for the ability to support all of these different DID methods so that you can just retrieve that DID document for any DID. And that's why we essentially built as our first thing this managed universal resolver, because it being universal is so important. The aim is just, as we kind of said from the beginning, like to take out the guesswork and take away the maintenance, and being able to just give the relying party the ability to carry out verification processes against any DID, like now and in the future, and not have to kind of, I think where we're still early in this ecosystem, not have to predict what they need or kind of worry about not setting up infrastructure that may be redundant if sort of an issuer starts switching to a different DID method. Why we decided to build a fully managed resolver, it's kind of because it's critical to the success of the verification process, and therefore it needs to be reliable and scalable and universally interoperable. The resolver sits at the bottom of the infrastructure stack to enable the client verification layer to just be interoperable with the rest of the ecosystem. We recently did some work on the Onyx by JP Morgan SDK, which can be used for issuing and verifying credentials. And previously, the SDK only supported DID Ether and DID Key, but with just a one-line code change that provides the endpoint and API key for the universal resolver, the SDK can now be extended to be used with all other supported DID methods. And so that's kind of why that's our like foundational piece. What's next for us is currently in beta testing, but it's the surrounding modules that a relying party needs to carry out the verification processes. That's what we call the verifier and validator, which you can see there. And we've broken everything out just to provide like maximum flexibility and composability. But in simple terms, the verifier kind of lets you answer, is this credential legitimate? Does the issuer of this credential consider it valid? And then the validator is like the business logic of the relying party. It asks, is this credential okay to be used in this given situation or for the purpose it's going to serve? If you think about kind of going to rent a car while you're on holiday and you're all excited because you're 18 and you can finally legally drive, and that's great. So you present your driving license credential to the car rental service, and the car rental service verifies it using the verifier that, yep, this is a legitimate credential issued by the British Driving License Agency, the DVLA, and it's still valid for 50 more years. That's great. But then the validator has rules that are specific to the rental company. And that says, in this country, you actually can't rent a car until you have a minimum of 1 year holding the license. Yes, the credential is a verified driving license, but the validator is what tells you that this credential actually isn't valid to carry out the intended action. And so that's where we kind of see all these building blocks start to come together. And there's also cases where you don't need the full verification flow. Like you already trust the credential. You just need to know, is it still valid at a specific point in time? Something like a hotel room key would be an example of that. That sort of FIDOS and the services that we're building right now, you can test out the resolver and kind of everything there. But we're continuously building, and like one of the big things for us is doing all the supporting technologies. So you can see like the usage logs and service APIs and everything that kind of on the enterprise relying party side you need to meet all the compliance and regulations. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to pass to kind of Tom any industry use cases, or if you have any questions kind of on that as a stack as well.
The VIDOS resolver is part of an ecosystem of tools that are sort of enterprise enabled. And basically what we're trying to do is take the burden off of you having to manage all the coming and changing, so that as a developer, you can just say Polygon or Ether or Bitcoin or whatever for this particular person that they've inputted. Go and fetch the details and bring me their credentials, bring me their DID document, etc. It's not the best analogy, but it's kind of like doing a Google search. You haven't got to do a Google search and say these sites and these sites and these sites and these sites. You just do it and it aggregates across all of its known nodes and brings you back the correct information in a presentable way that you're like, that's the most likely information they were looking for. Once you pair the resolver with the validator, the business logic like Misha talked about, and the verification, orchestration, authentication, etc., you almost have a all-in-one identity solution. And it can be complex if your building's up, something that's very highly secure, operates around very highly secure data. You can make it very complex, very strong. Or if it's just a simple, we're jumping in to see what POAPs this person has, it can be very quick. Just pull up the wallet address, pull up the POAPs, and stuff like that. But it very much comes down to the developers. We're really building sort of microservices here for you to pick and choose.
Cool. On the topic of finance, which is, I know, something we both wanted to talk about, especially since TBD is more focused on the financial industry. I'm curious, right? Banking institutions, I think you even mentioned JP Morgan, they tend to be a little bit more traditional and a little slower to adopt like more like high-tech stuff or whatever, So I'm curious, have you, in partnering with these more traditional institutions, found any pushback? What's the incentive for something like a bank to move towards SSI?
The financial services side is really interesting. Something that TBD actually I've seen has done a lot of fantastic content in, and one of the things that I've seen pushback around is actually just the language and the difficulty of kind of perceptions of the language of like decentralized, and decentralized doesn't always mean blockchain, and it doesn't always mean crypto, and like there is sometimes these stigmas that exist that actually are just down to language, and I think that is a tricky one, but we're sort of getting there around the education. And yeah, I would thank TBD for also a lot of the stuff that you've written around that. The other one that I've seen on pushback with banks is, and it's kind of understandable, but it's around the liability side of it. So there's this whole piece around like reusable ID, and obviously banks don't want to go and use an ID from that might have been issued by another bank, even though it proves that you are who you are, or etc., because the liability might still rest with them if there's something wrong with it. Now, what's interesting, and I know you mentioned EIDAS, but with EIDAS and kind of the regulations that are coming out there, and that is basically in the EU, just for summary, is this like introduction of kind of a whole digital identity verifiable credential ecosystem, but a big piece being this EU digital identity wallet. And one of the pieces within that is this personal identifier that is attached to these wallets. And that is issued by kind of government or trusted organizations. And so the liability of the identity kind of doesn't rest on the bank, it actually rests with the government. And so that has kind of helped ease some of these concerns, because I think banks understandably are pretty tired of being liable for everything. In terms of the incentives, again, they're sort of tied together. It's both the pushback and the incentives, but one of the incentives is definitely around that piece of identity fraud, because that is so catastrophic in banking industries. And I'll be honest, it's only really getting worse. It was kind of, I don't know if you saw, OpenAI actually made a whole statement recently saying like, if you're using voice verification systems, like get rid of them. Their technology and the models they're going to release, so which they haven't released yet because they're too dangerous, but will release. They've basically said that it will just like wipe out any security around voice verification. So in their statement, they outwardly said to banks, like, you need to change your digital identity systems. So we're seeing incentives this way because the need to be able to verify effectively, but also efficiently, because everyone's getting really tired of how cumbersome like any kind of verification with a bank is getting. So that's where we've seen most incentive, I'd say, from our side.
I did not know about the OpenAI part. That's crazy, and that makes a lot of sense around fraud. We have a comment that someone just said, like, kind of how e-commerce incentivized banks and financial institutions to embrace the internet and digital credit services. Love that. Okay, let's talk about. I don't even remember how you said it. You said IDA. Like, I'm not in your
things.
We assume that's how it's said. Like, we don't know.
Okay. Tell us about it. You all wrote to me that like 2.0 has gone into law in Europe. Like, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it means for y'all. Like, tell me more.
It's like, I'm gonna say it's really cool, but that's probably subjective. It's basically saying that all of the states within the EU, so all the countries that are part of the EU, which I think it's 27 or around that, it's like mainly saying around cross-border services and making that movement from different countries and cross-border services so much easier. It's kind of, when we first started the conversation around education, we were talking about how transitory people are now and sort of this moving around. What EIDAS does is it kind of sets the standards and the certifications around the wallet, etc. That if you, for example, have an ID issued in Italy and you have your kind of education credentials, etc., all from Italy, you can use those to apply for university in, say, Germany. And it's all interoperable. So that's kind of what the critical piece is you can super easily in one country open a bank account in another country using the credentials you have, rather than going through these like really long, convoluted systems. So a huge part of it is just that ease of movement, and seeing it more as like this interoperable ecosystem. And the kind of important things to know about EIDAS in terms of when it comes to the legal side is, I think it's by 2026, all public services, so all government services will have to accept these digital credentials as a way to authenticate into their systems. By 2027, I think it's still a should, but usually that means it's going to go ahead. All kind of like private sector where identity authentication is a critical piece of what they deliver, so like financial services, education,
renting a car.
Yeah, like all of those will then, and also one that's also included in that is big online platforms, your Amazons, etc. They all will have to accept these digital credentials as a way of authentication. So it's a big shift. The EU digital identity wallet is a piece within EIDAS too.
So the EU digital identity wallet is like an implementation of EIDAS legislation. EIDAS is slightly larger than that, and this is where it gets exciting. If you imagine your digital identity as like a collection of different Lego blocks of information, so some of it might be your medical record, some of it might be your driving license, some of it might be your things that you own or your university degree or whatever. EIDAS is a framework for other organizations to make their own official Lego blocks to go in part of this wallet. It's not just the framework, it's also the timeline that says so by 2026, 2027, these organizations will have to accept those building blocks as long as they're built to the specification. So it's quite exciting because, we have the EU wallet as like a first flagship piece, but we're going to see so many cool new products, protocols, and other applications be built under the same specification. And it's going to be really exciting to see what developers do with that and what other issuers take on as like, this is allowed, let people put this into their wallet. Like, you're a streamer, let's put that in your wallet. I've made
That's
a platform that lets streamers say they're a streamer officially and stuff like that.
I'm excited for you all and a little bit jealous.